All right, now without further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage Dr. Stephen Hicks, Dr. Richard Salsman, and Rob Tracinski. So these are three of our excellent Atlas Society scholars who you're going to hear from throughout the day, including on this opening State of the Culture panel, or as we're calling it, Are We Doomed or on the Edge of a New Golden Age? Introducing here first, Dr. Stephen Hicks is a professor of philosophy at Rockford University, the author of 7 books, including his world-renowned text Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism to Socialism, From Rousseau to Foucault. He also curated numerous courses here at the Atlas Society and is the author of Atlas Society publications such as The Pocket Guide to Postmodernism and The Pocket Guide to Philosophies of Education. Dr. Richard Salsman, seated right here on the right, is an assistant professor of political economy at Duke University, the founder and president of Intermarket Forecasting, and a senior fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. He is the author of 5 books, including his latest, Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? Essays in Moral Political Economy, which he has brought limited free copies of to sign during the breaks today. So those books are out on the registration table. That is where the scholars will be before lunch to do the meet and greet, and you can go out and get a copy of his book. Robert Tracinski, right here in the middle, studied philosophy at the University of Chicago and has been a lecturer, writer, and commentator for more than 25 years. He writes the Tracinski Letter e-newsletter and is the author of 2 of our most recent pocket guides, the Pocket Guide to Self-Interest and the Pocket Guide to Ayn Rand, which we debuted here today in your welcome bags, and there are extra copies of outside. So without further ado, I'd like to pass things off first here to Richard.
Great, thank you, Abby. Can I be heard? Okay. We are challenged to 10 minutes each. This won't be easy, but I'm going to try to set the standard right up front. Do have a clock here. I'm going to say we're not doomed. The question was what? Are we doomed or are we in the edge of a new golden age? I'm not sure quite what golden age means, but if we mean a freer society, a more capitalist society, a more individualist society, I do see that in our horizons. Now, we all have different horizons because some of us are old and some of us are younger. But I've seen enough to see how quickly America and the world can change. I mean, the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union, who would have guessed? But let me just give you a structure I work with, whether this is helpful or not. The 3 main enemies of capitalism. And by the way, I'm going to keep it more on a political, economic level. I'm going to do less about philosophy. But I would I don't know what you would name. I would name the top 3 enemies, threats, as environmentalism, socialism, and the last might surprise you, democracy. Democracy not in the sense of, some form of government that seems safe, but it's definitely the form of government that's most deified. No one questions it. Because what is demos? Demos are the people. So democracy is rule of the people. Who can possibly question the people? We used to have the divine right of kings. Divine, Vox Dei, the voice of God, told them what to do. And for that brief period in the Enlightenment, we had Vox Intellentia, the voice of reason. Once reason was attacked, what are we left with? We don't have God. We don't have reason. Let's just go with the peeps. Vox Populi. They used to say Vox Populi is the voice of God. Vox Dei. It's a very common expression. But see how dangerous that can be. Who are these people? How educated are they? How virtuous are they? Just the rule of the demos, without any restrictions on what they can do to you, it can be dangerous. And I think a subset of this is populism, peopleism, but I'm going to talk about that later at another session. We're going to have another session on that. But I think it's closely related to democracy. So if you think we're doomed, you would focus, I think, most, that my view would be on those 3 threats. Here's another way of looking at it. In political form, I think the manifestations these take, and this should be easy to remember, the welfare state, the warfare state, and what I call the lawfare state. Everyone knows what the welfare state is, this unjust redistribution of wealth. But the warfare state, I've become more and more concerned with that there seems to be some built-in kind of imperialist attitude, global reach, and all that. And I don't think it's capitalist. I think imperialism, or the idea of being policeman of the world, is an anti-capitalist thing. The last one, lawfare, it's more the regulatory state. You know what that is? They call it the swamp. It's the unelected bureaucrats who are just burgeoning in their power and control, complete separation, complete integration of powers, right? They make the laws, interpret the laws, adjudicate the laws, but we're also seeing lawfare, where the courts and attorney generals and others are being weaponized, the FBI, weaponized against political enemies. So that's a third threat. But let me finish with this, since I only have, a few minutes left. It's hard to put all this in. On the bright side, on the right side, if you look at on the right side of things, I mean politically, in sheer numbers, it's conservatives, libertarians, and objectivists, right? We know that. If you go to these student conferences, the conservative ones are the biggest, the libertarians are probably the second biggest, and then the objectivists are the third biggest. But in terms of, intellectual heft or influence or consistency, one of the reasons I'm optimistic is, first of all, those groups, and especially by age, have grown a lot, I think matured a lot. They certainly have a bigger shelf of material, intellectual weaponry, so to speak, than we had 50 years ago. So they have that at their, I don't know whether they have long attention spans to read this stuff, but that's a problem. But let me quickly say, within conservatism has always been, I think, a problem because it's conserving things. It's basically condoning and supporting and validating everything their enemies put in place over the last 50 years. So then they used to be against the antitrust laws, and then once they were in, now they're for them. Used to be against central banking and the income tax, now they're for it. Used to be against the Medicare and Medicare. In the beginning, they're against because they're reacting. But after a while, they just concede. So it's interesting because they're seen as the rock-ribbed, principled, standing in the, but actually they're very malleable and they're not setting the tone. So, but within, I think Rob knows this better than anyone, there is a very interesting debate. NatCons, what's the other ones? Free cons. I think the other one would be neocons. Everyone knows neocons. But neocons have that kind of more aggressive foreign policy idea that the U.S. should be all over the place, and they endorse the welfare state. But set that aside for a moment. These more recent attitudes are the free cons actually care about freedom. They're actually complaining that the conservative movement has not focused enough on freedom. So they're probably the better of the lot. But the middle one, well, I'm putting it as middle, national, there's a bit of nationalism, which is not pro-capitalist, that's in that part of the conservative movement. I don't want to get into all the gory details. The free cons, I think, are better than the others. But here's what most interests me. They're debating each other. They're fighting. They realize they failed. They realize, intellectually fighting each other. I think they realize they failed, that we're losing liberty and freedom, and they're not quite sure why. So at least they're debating within each other. But the heavy essential element there, I think you're going to find, is religion. On almost every level, they think it's very essential, and we don't believe that. They believe that religion is essential to keeping the free society going, and I don't. Now, within libertarians, let's assess that one very quickly. I have to stop at 35, right? Okay. We know there are anarchists. They are still around. So I think of them as, I think of anarcho-libertarians, so arguing that all states must necessarily be statist. That's not a good argument. It's not historically been true. But the other one is Christian libertarians. You'll get people like Ron Paul and others who are actually against women's choice, and so they bring in the conservative aspect of it. But they do want limited government. And then the last ones I would call, I guess, again, the better of the group is what I would call, for lack of a better phrase, libertarian constitutionalist. They just kind of take the American Constitution as given, not a bad starting point, and they heavily stress that. So they heavily stress more rights, protection of rights. They have the advantage of being consistently for civil rights, social rights, as well as economic rights. So they're perhaps the more serious of the group and closer, say, to our view. But again, the essential in conservatism was religion. Unfortunately, the essential in libertarianism is philosophic eclecticism. Their view is, we'll take anyone philosophically and hope liberty wins. Now, the last thing I'll say is, this is a little more controversial. There are three parts of objectivism, too. I'm not going to name names or name groups. I'm at the group I love, and I think we're doing great work. But you could, for those of you who've been in it long enough, see that some part of this movement is very insular, kind of dogmatic, combative, unwelcoming, malevolent. They would probably be on a panel like this and say, we are doomed, by noontime. So that's a hard thing to get excited about. Exclusive, exclusionary, kind of medievalist and insular. We're studying the texts. We're the specialists. You're not. End of story. There's another wing of the group that's very lifestyle oriented. It almost sounds Stoic to me. The Stoics, if you know, before the fall of the Roman Empire, withdrew from society. They said, we're doomed, but what we're going to do is just, be healthy, recreate, flourish, build websites. So it's what I call lifestyle It's perfectly fine. It's what I call lifestyle objectivism. And it's typically uplifting and stuff, but they also have this idea that objectivism is closed. There's no more to say or add to or amend the core philosophy that she left us. But notice that would make them move toward a more anti-intellectual, non-intellectual stance of, let's just get healthy and start websites and businesses and climb rocks. And you see, but it's perfectly fine. Ayn Rand said it is philosophy for living on Earth, so they're not wrong in that regard. I really like what we're doing because we're both scholarly and gentlemen. There's ladies here too. But there's an old phrase of he's a scholar and a gentleman. So you're not anti-intellectual, you're not superficial. We have scholars, we have really serious thinkers doing new things, exciting things. But the gentlemanly part is we try to be, right? Benevolent, open, welcoming, bridging. I call it bridging to conservatives and libertarians, which is verboten in some parts of this philosophy. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have to explain to them, yeah, you do have religion, but religion is a kind of primitive form of philosophy. We welcome you into a more enlightened form of philosophy. With the libertarians, you say, we really do need government, and you need to understand that we can make government behave, that it hasn't always misbehaved. So the last thing I would say, and one of the reasons I'm so optimistic, is I think our part of the right, which is a smaller in number part of the right, is actually more philosophically powerful. And I just have to go with the premise that if ideas are what drive history and cultures, then our kind of purest form and activist and benevolent form of these ideas is going to really be very influential over the coming decades. I'll stop there.
Okay, so when I got heard this topic, are we doomed or on the edge of a new golden age? My first initial response was to say yes. We are one or the other. The answer is not determined. This is the choice we have to make. But actually, one thing I wanted to do though was introduce. I'm a charts and graphs guy. I wanted to introduce some interesting data here. So let me see if this clicker works. Do I? I think I've got a clicker that allows me to do this. Maybe I'm putting it the wrong way. Okay, well, can you guys call up the... Oh, is it? It's up, okay. So this is something fascinating. It sheds light on this question of are we doomed or not? Okay. It sheds light on this question of are we doomed or not. The Washington Post, about a month ago, had this great article where they had some guys go out do a poll and ask people what was the best era for all sorts of different things, like the most moral society, the best music, the best fashion, the best economy, etc. And they found they got this chaos of a result, no consistent result, until they adjusted for what age people were. What age each respondent was when he thought everything was the best. And they got a really consistent result, and that's what's up over here. You notice the most consistent one is for the best music. The best music is whatever was popular when you were 17 years old. and after that it becomes, our music is so much better than that noise the kids are listening to these days. So after that, you're not interested in new music. And then the other thing is, if I could do the next one here. Yeah. You can see that consistent result that it's your age you were. But here's the interesting thing is that then they asked people, what is the worst time for everything? And everybody had one answer that was most popular. What's the worst time for everything? Right now, right? And so you see, and this is a long chart here, but you can see that, for example, people think the economy is worse now, slightly worse now than it was in the Great Depression. There's about as much war right now as there was during World War II. Race relations, so there's less, racial equality is slightly worse than it was in the 1950s, when we still had segregation. So people think now is the worst time that has ever happened, even when it's clearly objectively wrong. Right, so I just wanted to introduce this to sort of put the context when we're talking about sort of evaluating the state of the world. So we can go back out of it. That there is a natural bias. There's a natural nostalgia devoted to the past, and it's really not nostalgia for the way things actually were. It's nostalgia for what it was like when you were a kid, because your parents were shielding you from everything, and everything seemed much better. And then you get out into the world and you read the news, and you start reading the newspapers, and everything looks like it's worse. And then there's a natural doomerism sort of applied to the present. Things are terrible now. And of course, 30 years from now, you'll look back on what you thought was terrible today, and it will be the golden age. It'll be the good old days. All right, so this is the sort of natural bias I think we have to overcome. So I do want to say, part of my answer to this is we are in the golden age right now. Right, things as they are right now are actually really amazingly good. And I think it's the failure to appreciate that sometimes leads to a lot of problems. If you think everything's terrible right now, you don't mind tearing things down and taking, making radical solutions, either radical solutions to the left or radical solutions to the right. We need to tear down the whole existing system. And if you don't realize how good things are right now, you are going to destroy things that are actually beneficial. And so that doomerism is something we have to counteract. And so what I say is, it gives you an idea of that, for example, recent figures came out that America is now like the wealthiest country the wealthiest large country. There's a couple of examples like Liechtenstein. They have a very small population, very wealthy, but we're the wealthiest large country in the world, and we've shot past most of the European countries on that. We had better recovery from the pandemic, and we're back to our growth pattern, our long-term growth trend line, and they're not. So, we are basically the wealthiest people who have ever existed in all of human history. So that's the sense in which we are currently in the golden age right now. So I think the attitude has to be more like what Eddie Willers says in Atlas Shrugged, which is don't let it go. The attitude has to be, let's appreciate what we have right now, but then the question is going to be, how do we preserve this? How do we keep this golden age going on? Now, there are aspects in which we're not in a golden age. A lot of bad things in the culture and bad art being created and things like that. But the attitude I think has to be don't let it go, don't let this be destroyed. So then that leads to the question of, well, what is the basis for what we have achieved? For the wealth and technological progress and the degree of freedom that we have. And it's based on certain ideas that were widely accepted in the founding of America, widely accepted throughout American history. The ideas of reason, the Enlightenment ideas of reason and individualism, political freedom, rational self-interest. One thing I've been on sort of emphasizing recently is objectivists tend to talk about Ayn Rand's morality of rational self-interest being radical and a complete break from the past. And I've really been doing some more research and realizing that's actually not as radical because, if Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, he comes to America in 1832 and he finds that, he writes later that, the doctrine of self-interest properly understood, essentially a version of rational self-interest. He says it's universally accepted, you hear it as much from the poor as from the rich. So this is sort of the official moral philosophy of the Enlightenment, was a version of rational self-interest. And it was widely accepted in America. And then, of course, that gets displaced by altruism comes to America, the philosophy of altruism, the idea that self-sacrifice, and everybody has to sacrifice their interests for the common good. And that becomes dominant. But these are ideas that were widely accepted. I think they're still implicitly widely accepted. Reason, rational self-interest. Most people actually act on what you might call enlightened self-interest in their normal lives, but those ideas now are oftentimes without a name, and usually without a defense. And I think that sort of defines the challenge of how do you come up with we don't have to come up with it exists, but how do you spread, how do you promote the philosophical foundations of the great achievement of our civilization? If we're in a golden age, but people don't necessarily understand and accept the ideas that made that golden age possible. And that's what we're trying to promote to people. So the last thing I want to say on that is the biggest danger I see is that the lingering and sort of leftover hostility to those ideas. And we're talking about the state of the right and the nationalist conservatives. And so the thing that I found one of the things I found most ominous sort of coming from the national conservative wing is J.D. Vance, the new vice presidential candidate. He's giving a speech at the convention. He says, America is not an idea. Well, he kind of went halfway. He said, America's not just an idea. He says, we have ideas, but America's not an idea. And says we're a people. We have a shared history. And basically, America is not based on ideas, it's based on tradition. And this is very much the nationalist conservative. He was doing the halfway version of it. But if you go look, America is not an idea. I just did this because I'm writing an article on it. And you can find this standard sort of nationalist conservative talking point, a whole bunch of them. They really hate the idea that America is based on ideas. Because it's based on ideas, it's based on the Enlightenment. It's based on these secular ideas from the Enlightenment. They're based on reason and individualism. And the religious wing of the right is opposed to that. And I think that what's more dangerous than, oh, they have religious ideas they want to put over. What's more dangerous is the idea of saying this is not about ideas, right? And so if the point is we're in this made this tremendous progress of wealth and technology and freedom, and there are ideas at the base of that, and we need to promote and preserve and better understand those ideas. The most dangerous thing is people saying no, it's not about ideas at all. And if it's not about ideas, then what is it about? Well, it's about tradition. It's about history. It's about and if you go further, some people say it's about race and ethnicity and that sort of thing, and then that's a direction we don't really want to go. So I think that the biggest problem I see, because Richard's saying that there's a division between the NatCons and the free cons. Well, I think the free cons are really not doing well at all right now. So I think the problem right now that we have primarily is that if you look at a side that's going to defend the ideas that are the basis for these amazing achievements of American civilization, there is no major party or faction or intellectual movement that is providing such a defense. I think the right approach, back in the Reagan era, the right was more receptive to that. You said something, I'm only got a few seconds left, but you said something years ago that struck me in this context, which is, it's good. No, it's good. I mean, it's something I agree with. You said that you thought the sort of Reagan era, that revival of freedom had to do with the bicentennial, 1976, 200th year anniversary. And there was this burst of scholarship, for example, in the late 20th century of people going back and studying the ideas of the founding fathers and taking them seriously and promoting that. And I think that's the concern I have, is that sort of the benefits of that have kind of faded. And what we need is a revival of an interest in what are the ideas and a better understanding of what are the ideas. And the only intellectual movement that's really engaged in that, like you said, the libertarians are philosophically eclectic and they're paying the price for that right now. The only movement that's doing that is the objectivists. So I think that's what sort of defines the major task that we need to take on.
My two colleagues are more optimistic than I expected them to be, which is good, because I think I'm on that page as well. But we do have a lot to worry about. Right? Many trend lines are positive, many trend lines are negative, and I think we would all agree there is no preset direction that history is going to take us. We will make or break ourselves. And we have a very abstract philosophy, and ideas matter. And I've spent my entire professional career inside the academic world, where most of the things that we are worried about started, were incubated, and then have been spilling out into the culture. And in many subsectors within the academic and broadly intellectual world, it's a very depressing place to hang out. So at the same time, I'm comforted by saying that there's a project that we all engage in. We have this philosophy, it's very abstract, and it's romantic. It's about adventure, being the best that you can be, unlimited human potential, and so forth. And as an abstract set of propositions, it's very attractive, but there is a huge amount of work that we all have to do in taking that abstract philosophy and operationalizing it into our lives, my actual thinking habits, my actual emotional habits, my actual physical habits. And it's a very hard project often to step back in our own lives and say, how am I doing? Right? Am I doomed individually, or am I on the edge of a golden age and things are going to go well? And that's a difficult project to figure out for one's own life. So the question of this panel is in some ways daunting, because then I have to say, not just me, but my whole society and the whole world, how are we doing overall? Now, huge amount of data, a huge amount of social science, huge amount of history is going to bear on that. But I found myself thinking about some psychology points that taking the abstract philosophy and internalizing it in one's life, but then since so much of what we do in our friendships, our careers, and so forth is social, there's a huge amount of social psychology that is also directly relevant to how we are doing in our own lives, assessing our own lives, and assessing how our culture is going on. So I want to just highlight a few things to keep in mind while we're trying to answer that question. Golden age or doom. One thing that we are all very good at, particularly those of us who are more intelligent, more alert, more trying to pay attention to what's going on in the world, is taking a data point and extrapolating it. If we have this issue, and often we are focusing on that issue in isolation from all of the other issues, then it leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to some point. So it's very good, and I think smarter, more alert people are more prone to taking that data point to its end, and if you're starting with a negative data point, there's lots of them, to reach doom, and then that fills your psychology, right? Okay, and that's a natural then place to be. And it is more difficult to do that extrapolation, but then to pause and step back and say, I did take this data point out of context for now, to put it back in context with all of the other relevant data points, and to say that maybe in extrapolating there are 4, 5, or 6 steps, but at each of those steps, right, there are going to be checks that are in place and points of assessment where we might go back. So keep in mind the easy extrapolation issue in trying to answer this question. Another social psychology point and psychology point is taking one trait and generalizing it from that. And again, smart, quick-minded people are very good at generalizing from 1 or 2 data points. So we meet someone and they're having a bad day, or we meet a group of people, they're having a bad day, and we then make a more general comment, or judgment rather, that's the way this person is all the time in all circumstances. And that's, of course, a useful thing to keep in mind, but it is, given that amount of data, a hypothesis, and the harder thing is to say, I've only seen this person from a limited perspective. I need to have more data before I make the judgment. Social media, where we see only a slice of people on a set of issues, and they might be doing something bad, saying something terrible and worrisome and so forth, to generalize to that person is just irredeemably bad, or this person is representative of a certain group and they are irredeemably bad. Be aware of that as an issue. Another one I find myself as I'm getting older is I think of this point as the I can't believe we're having this discussion again point. Right? Where I thought about some issue, right, 30, 40, however many years ago, and engaged in certain arguments, and I did my thinking, and it seemed like history has borne out, and there's lots of data available. And yet, when I go on social media, you don't have to look very far to find exactly the same arguments being made from all sorts of perspectives, and so forth. So why do we have to have this argument again? And it seems like we are just spinning our wheels and therefore not making any progress on that particular issue. So I think the corrective there is to recognize that when we have a more open, liberal society, it is to be expected that every generation is going to have to, will, raise the same issues. And that there are lots of perspectives that we might say they are mistaken, but there are subtle mistakes on pretty easy, basic issues that people will make, and that will take them down a certain road. And so we should expect that every generation, the same debates will be engaged in by the young people, and that's normal, that's to be expected, that's part of the learning process. The harder part is then to say, how long do they stay with those positions? Are there the corrective positions and arguments being made more vigorously, and are we overall, say, demographically making progress? And there I think we need better data. So embrace the fact that every generation is exploring all of the positions, including a lot of the weird positions. That's part of the learning process in an open, liberal, free society. And of course, there's the old point that bad news sells, so we should expect going into social media to be dominated by negativity, and one has to go out of one's way to find more good news. And in a way, that also is a sign of health, that we can focus on the negative, that we take so much for granted, expect things to go well, that when something goes bad, it grabs our attention, it grabs everybody's attention, and then we're more likely to do something about it. Also, I wanted to say something about the way liberal, open societies work. And I think there's a weakness that I think is built into the kind of society that we want to have, that I think those of us who are attracted to a liberal in the proper sense, open, free society, start out as more benevolent people initially. We trust ourselves, we trust other people, that if we have a lot of freedom, by and large, people will make good choices and do good things with that. And then the more we get into that philosophy and that set of ideas, we are confirmed in that. And that can, I think, lead to a certain naive benevolence, that we expect huge numbers of other people to be just like we are. So that then sets us up for being shocked when we run into people who are genuinely not benevolent. And in many cases, we are then slower to react than we otherwise would be. And I think that's fine. So just be aware that if you have a benevolent outlook on yourself and society in general, that you should build in the check of not letting that lead you to naivety. But at the same time, that benevolence, I think, leads to a willingness to let other people try, to let other people fail, and we should expect a lot of failure, a lot of weird experimentation to go on in our society. And the mere fact that we are having so many knock 'em dead, drag 'em out arguments on social media, and we're well aware of all of the weird experimenting that's going on socially, while that is distressing at some level, at the same time it is a sign of health, that we have a kind of society where we are having those kinds of discussions and all of that experimenting is going on. The track record of liberal societies in dealing with knock 'em dead argumentation and widespread lifestyle experimentation is pretty good. We allow it, it happens, and then when we need to, we stand up. We've had the arguments, we make a decision, or people step over the line and they start to become, they're experimenting, affecting other people. We then do the correction. So it's an ongoing, lots of imperfections that are going on, but a perfecting process to the extent that it is open. All right, I wanted to say one more thing. I have to say, poverty, plagues, and wars, the things that have dominated much of human history, and I think we're making progress in solving them. While those, I think, are part of the human condition, if you think of our situation with respect to poverty now compared to the past, we just went through a major plague, and as bad as it was not as bad as the plagues were in the past. We are engaged in wars. There's lots of wars around the world, but they are being fought mostly other places, not on our home soil, and they are not as bad as they are in the past. If you take all of the issues that worry us and divide them into kind of foreign affair issues and internal issues, I would say if we're going to worry about the ones we really should be worrying about are the internal issues. Islamists, Russia, China, right, and so on. Yes, those are problems. The more serious adversaries are the people inside our own institutions, inside our own countries. One lesson of history has been that the nations that have been successful nations, by and large historically, that have failed. Some of them have failed because they were conquered by external enemies. That's a small percentage. The ones that failed were mostly ones that gave into dissolution, into decadence, and raised a whole crop of internal enemies that destroyed and rotted them from inside. That's the bigger fear. There was a song a few years ago, Don't Worry, Be Happy. I like so I think the don't worry part is too wrong. We do need to worry, but the big thing is to contextualize and and do good risk assessment on the nature of those worries while, of course, be happy. We've got so much to be happy about.
All right, hello, hello. All right, we're going to start Q&A. We've got somebody with the mic over there, somebody with the mic over here, so raise your hands. And
Hey, first of all, I want to say thank you for everything. It's been very, very interesting. I do have a quick question. You mentioned that the same conversation has been made over and over again with the younger people, right? And I would like to know if maybe we've been looking at only two options for far too long, right? Either left or right, either right or wrong, and that has caused division. And nowadays we are looking at a kind of, it's not new, but with the new liberal way of thinking, not liberal as an American, but more like what Mises and Hayek were talking about. And I was wondering if this may be a chance that this may be a new way of looking at the world and to maybe perhaps looking at a better option. Thank you. I don't know if I was clear.
So I heard that the options sometimes are right, wrong, and left, right. I'll leave the left, right issue. Yeah, that's a weak way of arranging the political spectrum. But I would think that there are dualities in philosophy when we get down to it that are fundamentally right, wrong. And so, as an individual, and we know that we're facing many of these dualities. I'm going to try or I'm not. I'm going to think about things and keep my mind open to all of the evidence and be open-minded and to corrections and so on, or I'm not. So I think there are all of these dualities. At the same time, when we get to most big issues, aside from the principles, there are in fact many options. Psychological options, business options, friendship options, political options, economic system options, and so on. So you're right to say that we do need to be aware of more than just the issues that come to us in a prepackaged form. And maybe it's a good thing. I would need to see statistics on that more people are becoming aware of the wider range of options that are out there.
We have the next question right here. Thanks.
Good morning. I have a small question. It's about the God thing. So when Nietzsche said that God was dead, he meant that man had killed him. And while he might have been the most famous atheist of all time, he had some concerns about that. And what I'm wondering, I guess we weren't all ready to be Ubermenches. My question is, given human nature, can a very large society hold itself together without some significant number of people within it having some level of fear about a final judgment?
Oh, that's a great question. Mind if I take this? Yeah, so I've been writing about this a lot, actually. I have a new piece coming out in the next couple weeks. Because I think that part of what's going on with left versus right, and especially with the religious conservatives right now, is I think they're in a panic because if you look, again, I don't have this chart graph already, but if you look at some recent polls that have been done, and they show that basically religious belief in America is kind of doing this. It's falling off a cliff. And this has been happening since roughly the late 1990s. This was like a 80-90% Christian nation. And in some of the more recent polls, people who describe themselves as nothing in particular, now there's a group combination of atheists, agnostics, and people who are, maybe they're not atheists, but they don't have any particular religious commitment. That group is now like 28% of the population. It's more than the number of evangelical Christians. And so part of what's going on right now, I think, on the right, and the reason they're leaning so hard into nationalism and into the religious right, is they're in a panic. They're thinking, oh my God, we're losing the culture. I think gay marriages will sort of threw them over the cliff on that. So there is this question of, well, how could we possibly survive without religion? But I also say we are kind of doing it, and we have been doing it. I think that there is a fear of, well, how can we do this without God? But, like a lot of people in this room have probably a lot of personal comfort with the idea that, yes, we can do this. As someone who's been an atheist since basically the age of 12, the idea that, you can have moral rules to guide you
and you can have things that are fulfilling in your personal life, things that fill your soul and provide you with a sense of meaning and purpose without having God. That's second nature to me. I've been doing it basically my entire life. So this is possible, and I think Americans, again, one of the things I said earlier is Americans are implicitly have this sort of Enlightenment philosophy. That cultural legacy hasn't been wiped out. A lot of people are implicitly acting on that. And I think we need to get to the point where we're comfortable explicitly embracing it and saying, yes, we can have a free society, we can have orderly society, we can have a moral society without needing the prospect of, oh, you're going to be punished in hell for all of eternity if you do something wrong. Well, how about just the incentive that, if you do something wrong, your life will be worse here for the rest of the time you have on Earth, right? Isn't that enough incentive? And I think it is enough incentive. I think people actually do act on that. So I think that explains some of the anxiety of our current moment, is people are in a panic of what do we do, or at least a subset of people are in a panic. What do we do if we don't have this traditional basis for society?
And I just add that if the question is among a rational ethic and philosophy, a reason-based one, versus a faith-based one, versus nihilism, it totally makes sense to me that a religious person would fear the relativists, the nihilists, the ones that don't believe in anything, anything goes, that kind of thing. But so do we. Notice, so do we. And what we share in common, like objectivists, with religion, is we're absolutists. They're absolutist about what the divine is telling them, these commandments. But when you think about it, we're basically saying rational egoism should be an absolute. Objectivity should be an absolute. You don't compromise on these things. So there's a bridge I often find with religious people. I'll tell them, we're both absolutists. Now the question is whether we're in the Enlightenment mode or the medieval mode. And we shouldn't be medievalists. We're in a modern period. Stephen specializes in postmodernism, but the postmoderns really want pre-modern. They really want to destroy the Enlightenment, which would bring us back to the medieval pre-Enlightenment period. So I just want to throw that in. There is a bridge you can make. Ayn Rand in the Tom Snyder interview was asked, why has objectivism had not as big of influence as religion? This is like 1979. And she said, well, religion has had a 3,000-year start. Give us some time. But she also said religion is a primitive form of philosophy. She was kind of complimenting it by saying it's a philosophy. But it's just not an enlightened, rational philosophy. So we're still with philosophy. Let's just make sure it's enlightened.
There's data, I think, that bears on your question as well, Brent. If you take your list of the most successful countries currently existing, the United States is an outlier in terms of how religious it is. So if you look at Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Northwestern Europe especially, and those are going to make it onto most people's list of successful nations, among the most successful nations in the world. Levels of religion belief is extraordinarily low in all of those societies. So,
I would have liked to hear a little bit more of a healthy respect for doom from the three of you. Basically, one of you said, we live in a golden age, Rob, and I think the only example you gave is with the wealthiest country. And Richard sort of reiterated that and mentioned that we're getting rid of poverty and so on. I think these are the most, it would occur to me that these might be the most dangerous of times. When I grew up in the post-war era, and there was a healthy respect for communism and danger. But now, if I go to somebody and try to tell them, here, read this 1,000-page book, it'll give you a whole new philosophy. Hey, man, we're doing good. We're prosperous. We've went through a plague and so on. So people don't have a healthy respect that they need to be open to listening to challenges to the current consensus. That's my worry.
I want to move to your neighborhood, Phil, because the people you're hanging out with are way more optimistic than most of the people I encounter these days. No, I think one of the things that I sort of campaign against, because in objectivism there is a certain history. Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged is kind of a doomerist premise, right? Because she was not somebody who believed in gloom and doom, but the premise of Atlas Shrugged is basically what if 1957 is the peak and everything after that goes downhill? And that's basically the premise of Atlas Shrugged. And now she's projecting, she even talked about projecting, intellectuals are good at projecting from a few data points and taking it to the full conclusion. So she's projecting from what if the current bad trends of the moment, what if they were to continue, what if they were to become dominant, and what if they were to take over? She's projecting that and then saying, well, what would be the answer to that, right? So, but I think because of that, there is a certain doomerism that has gotten into the sense of life or gotten into the attitudes of people who have encountered objectivism. So I think the appeal of objectivism can't depend on you think the world's going to hell in a handbasket, because that's not always going to be the case, right? So, and that's one thing I wanted to mention, that last thing we didn't really cover though, but I'm going to be talking about aesthetics tomorrow morning. And so we hadn't really talked about the aesthetic thing, but Stephen talked about the need to not only to internalize the philosophy, to know what it means to actually be acting on a rational philosophy. And for that, we need art. We need art as that concrete projection of what it means. And I think if I were to say the most dangerous situation right now is we don't have a lot of good art projecting what it means. I mean, there's stuff out there being done by other people. But, basically, if you look at objectivism, what do we have for art? Well, we've got Ayn Rand. We've got novels that were written, 70 years ago almost now. So I think we need to also be focusing more on, the projection in art, the projection in the culture, the projection in movies and TV shows and what have you, of what a rational philosophy means, what it means to act on it and live on it in a concrete sense.
Can I just comment quickly? This phenomenon of complacency during good times is very noticeable to me as well. But if you remember 16 years ago during the financial crisis, what happened with Ayn Rand's books? It just skyrocketed, right? So there is a problem where they'll go along, and then there's an emergency. And it's like, okay, now I'll read the instruction booklet, now a break glass in emergency. So we need to advocate the idea that we're constantly thinking about applying, advocating this philosophy, not just in dangerous times, because in dangerous times, really bad policies can be enacted. But if that's what you're saying, I have noticed that as well. But that's just an argument for being more active during good times, if you want to call them good times, intellectually active advocacy.
Good morning, everyone. My question is directed to Stephen and Richard, since you're both in academia. So I started college as a religious conservative and finished my first degree and second degree as a Marxist feminist, Marxist feminist atheist. I began my Ph.D. Wanting to study the deconstruction and reconstruction of modern sovereignty from a post-colonial feminist institutionalist perspective. So my question is, how do young people in academia find objectivists? Are there objectivists in academia? How do we create more of them? Because I didn't find anyone there when I was going through. My journey to objectivism was self-taught. It was from the internet. My professors were mostly left-leaning. There were a couple political science and economics professors who were conservative, but not necessarily. I don't think I came across anyone libertarian or even remotely objectivist. So, and maybe this is just in Canada, because I'm from Canada. Maybe there's more variety in the United States, but I want to know, as professors in universities, how do we encourage objectivism? Because right now I'm very jaded when it comes to academia, because what I see is professors signing letters to ban other professors from speaking on certain topics, or forcing universities to make political statements and all of that. So how do you encourage your students, especially those who want to go into academia, to really take on the mantle of objectivism and sort of put it forward?
I feel your pain. So let me just say, though, I'm going to be giving a talk 2 sessions from now, Ayn Rand and the Moral Philosophers, talking about the academic world and academic philosophy and literature directly. So I will defer my answer until that session. As for the student issue, I don't know, Richard, do you want to take up talking to students in the current academic environment?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say very quickly is a professor once said very profoundly, some of my best students I've never met. Meaning what? Their books are being read from afar. You know, Mises would say this. He had seminars and things like that. And even Ayn Rand might have said that. But then there's millions of people reading their books. And there's a whole shelf full of objectivist books, economists, philosophers, psychologists. And so that as a student, if your question is, how do I find a bunch of objectivists at Yale? The answer, you won't. But why does that mean you can't read the objectivist professors that are on your shelf? You know, and you do have to do what Ayn or Leonard one time called double entry bookkeeping. You have to do what they want from you in school. And I would devote my summers during college to reading the right stuff. And then when I go to school, then I read Keynes. Then in the summer I'd read Hazlitt. Then I go to school and read Keynes. You know how it works. But I advise students to be bold, to not be quiet about their views. Don't ever combat the professor because they could have it over you. But a lot of students tell me that the biggest pressure they get and the biggest pushback and isolation as they get is from peers, not from professors. So, you know, one thing I like about what you are saying about your profile is you're persuadable. You've moved from all these different, and the students at this level, meaning 18 to 25-year-old, are persuadable. They're movable. Those are the things I would say mostly. Be open-minded, be bold, don't be quiet. A lot of students bite their tongue at universities, and when they speak up, and I encourage them to, these other students, it might be only 10%, 15% of the student body will gravitate to them. They become leaders. So if you're courageous enough to do that.
Well, on that, I want to add one thing, which is I'm not an academic, but I am somebody who used to run a campus objectivist club. And if there was any profile that Ayn Rand and objectivism had on our campus, it was because of the students creating this club and having events and giving talks and bringing in, we brought in Richard at least once, bringing in people to give, you know, objectivist intellectuals to give talks. So that's the other thing is that, you know, objectivism is still a small movement. We're not going to have a lot of academics simply because of the number of people. I think our academics are better than other people's academics, but it's going to, you know, a lot of it also depends on having students out there who are having events and spreading these ideas and at least making people aware of them.
I also stress to them not to fall into victimology. So libertarian, conservative, objectivist students will often whine and complain about the fact that the curriculum is biased or the professors are biased, and you can't don't go down that route. That's not worth it. It's not dignified. I would start things like, I call them the FOLs, and when the students get to campus, they eventually figure out, what is this? Friends of Liberty. And I take them for coffee off campus. I'll just say I'm meeting for coffee downtown on Saturday if anyone wants to come and chat and talk, and the group grows over time. And they're mostly from the right, but this is the chance they get to talk to a professor or other professors, I'm not the only one, kind of off the record without pressure. And that can be fun too. But I basically tell them, you have to work harder than the other side. Because the other side comes in, and as my colleague Mike Munger says, they get pat on the head, you're a good little environmentalist, you're a good little socialist, and they cruise through and they have no problem. The conservatives, libertarians, and objectivists have to work really hard. You have to be better, you have to be smarter, you have to work harder. You actually have to be more polite. You have to be kind and benevolent. Because your views are radical, it's going to hit people as combative. So the personality has to be dialed down to persuasive, rational, calm, if that makes sense.
All right, speaking of pressure, I don't think Richard could sense me over his shoulder here. All right, well, we ran a little bit over time, so if you guys could take a quick 5-minute break, get up, refresh your coffee, use the restroom, and be back here at 10:30, really appreciate it. See you guys in 5 minutes.